Hello and welcome to our virtual pedagogy panel on supporting LGBTQ students in the creative writing classroom, sponsored by AWP and the Creative Writing Studies Organization. We're fortunate to have with us today for our discussion Anel I. Flores, Alexa Garvoille, and Ruben Quesada. Let me introduce our panelists and then we'll get right to our discussion. Anel I. Flores, MFA, is an artist whose craft manifests as graphic storytelling, poetry, prose, sterling silver sculpture, oil paintings, and action. Her teaching career includes 11 years in public high school, college, and university, along with 4 years in arts administration and community literary workshops. Flores' areas of study and production of literary fiction and visual art center around Chicana Latina literature, lesbianidad, sexuality, gender, race, border, diaspora, spirituality, body, blood, memory, and their connection to identity. Flores was awarded the Catalyst for Change Award from NALEC and the Surdna Foundation, Best Local Poet, Women's Advocate of the Year from University of Texas, San Antonio, the Dimbrija Creadores Award from the Universidad del Alcalá de Henares in Madrid, Spain, Best of San Antonio Local Author 2017, the Chingona in Literature Award 2016, the Ancinas Award at Squaw Valley, the NALEC Fund for the Arts Award, the Acción Women Inspiring Women Award, the Yellow Rose of Texas Educator Award, and the Mentorship Leadership Award from the National Performance Network. She is co-editor of the forthcoming Hota anthology with Karima Press and author of the Lambda Literary Award-nominated book Empanada, a lesbiana story and probaditas. She is currently in the process of completing her forthcoming book, Cortinas de Lluvia, a series of children's books, and a graphic memoir titled Pintada de Rojo. Alexa Garvoille, MFA, is a queer educator and creative writing studies scholar. After 10 years teaching high school English and creative writing, she earned her MFA from Virginia Tech. She edits poetry for NCTE's English Journal and serves on the board of the Creative Writing Studies Organization. Her poems have appeared in Tinderbox Poetry Journal, Lavender Review, Mount Island, Homology Lit, and elsewhere. She has published on creative writing pedagogy in NCTE's English Journal and Bloomsbury's Imaginative Teaching Through Creative Writing, a guide for secondary classrooms. Her research interests include secondary ELA creative writing pedagogies, anti-racist education, and inclusive workshop practices. Ruben Quesada, PhD, is a poet, critic, translator, editor, and community organizer. He is the author of the poetry books Revelations and Next Extinct Mammal, and translator of Exiled from the Throne of Night, selected translations of Luis Cernuda. The recipient of a 2021 Individual Artist Grant from the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events, he is at work on a video anthology of contemporary Latinx poetry. He is the founder of the Latinx Writers Caucus, an organization concerned with education, equity, and inclusion of Latinx writers. He served as a member for the PEN America Literary Awards Committee, a judge for the Publishing Triangle Awards, and a vice chair of the 2020 State of Illinois Poet Laureate Search Committee. He has taught poetry, literary translation, and Latinx literature around the country at University of California, Northwestern University, Vermont College of the Fine Arts, the School of the Art Institute, and the UCLA Writers Program. Currently, Ruben is a blogger of contemporary poetry and poetics for Kenyon Review and serves on the board and as VP of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion of the National Book Critics Circle. He lives in Chicago, where he works as a site coordinator and translator for the Illinois Humanities Council. In his spare time, he is the program director for the Mercy Street Readings, a monthly 60-minute literary broadcast. First question. what are some ways in supporting LGBTQ students in the creative writing classroom that we can move from a pedagogy of sensitivity to a pedagogy of radical inclusion?
I can start us out. I'll start by saying that white people shouldn't be defining radical inclusion. And also, I think in terms of our queer students in the creative writing classrooms being out as one is comfortable as an educator is really helpful to them and creates a safe space for them. And assigning a wide variety, this is all kind of basic, but assigning a wide variety of texts from a variety of viewpoints. One year when I was teaching ninth grade English, we were about 6 weeks into the year, and one of my students said, "Oh wow, Miss Garvoille, I think we've read only queer writers so far this year." And I hadn't even realized that. So it goes both ways, but to be able to have such a wide variety and to have it be like the norm for students to be reading like non-normative identity-based texts, I think is really important in starting that dialogue.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Anyone else have anything they want to add?
Yeah, I'll hop in. I started teaching in 99, or I think it was 99, my first year. And so, I mean, although, and I'm in Texas, I have to say that specifically because just last week, Texas, sadly, governor signed a bill removing the, not allowing teachers to talk about critical race theory or just any progressive ideas or bringing in politics or current events. We're absolutely like, it's against the law now. So that's like a thing, it was taken away and now it's back in, right? So as we continue to fight, part of the thing, part of what I want to say about that is when I started, I was in a similar place of not being allowed to speak of my identity or who I am or bring in new texts. And then I was able to see how we were able to bring in new texts at a certain time period. And now texts are taken away from our Texas teaks. And it's just to echo what Alexa said, just being as queer as possible all the time. And even lips, I bring that up because I wear lipstick, and it has become just a conversation starter for me, because people are like, "Oh, you're a butch, or are you a trans man, or what's your identity?" Now I'm like, I'm going to put this lipstick on because I want the question now. I want to be able to have a reason to say it, not just to say it. Intentionally about queerness and LGBT ideas and what we're wearing, what we're doing, how we're moving, but also bringing in text. Yes, absolutely, the text. And also, part of this like radicalizing and bringing back bringing this into our education system is bringing in collaborators from community, right? Bringing in zines, people that are publishing and editing zines, bringing in blogs, bringing in technology, bringing in social media, and how we can use those ways that there are classrooms outside of the walls, right? And how do we make sure that we're very, very intentional about saying, okay, go to this place, go here. And that's like a classroom out of the wall, right? Go meet up, go look up Ruben's work, right? And then you're going to know, here's this name, past just doing like this also, under the table type of things. I used to take my window. We have this like one little classroom window, those little glass things. I used to tape paper over it because I would teach books, and I would tell my students, if anyone over 18 comes in, you switch. You put your novel under your desk and you take out your standardized packet. That's a true story. My department head knew that, but our dean didn't know, and our vice principal didn't know. It was always like I had these secrets, and you still have to now, right? So that's something I want to talk about, just collaborators, just to add that in.
Oh, yeah. Oh, wow. That's great. Yeah. Once you close the door to your classroom, you need to take it over. Yeah. Anyone else have anything they want to add to that? That's great.
Anel, just now as you were talking about kind of having your someone in your department kind of on your side, I'm reminded of the experience that I have teaching high school. So I taught at the Chicago High School for the Arts here in Chicago a few years back, and it's a small school, but one thing that I found really valuable is having not only the department chair but also the administrators really supportive of inclusion, of difference. And one way that I saw them really kind of demonstrate that was by setting time aside during the academic year, typically at the start, by conducting somewhat of an orientation where not only did we as faculty, but students as well, learn kind of the language to use for inclusion, whether it meant being sensitive to or recognizing the various forms of gender identities, or just acknowledging and being in the practice of using the correct pronouns for individuals, but really seeing everyone within the institution as a human being deserving of dignity and respect, and being able to communicate that on a daily basis, and just having kind of that system in place that really supports all of that, really, I think, gave me the flexibility to teach the content that I wanted to teach. And I was in a very fortunate space where I didn't feel that I had to really censor the content that I was teaching, and I was able to teach books from various types of writers, of various gender and sexual identities, or different forms of intersectionalities. And it was really because the tone was set by the administration or by the chair of the department. And I think that's really important, is to ensure that you communicate not only to your faculty, but to your students, that it's okay to be curious and to explore through different types of literature in the classroom.
Great. So basically, it's if you have supportive administrators, that's great, and you can create a supportive atmosphere. And if you don't, you need collaborators. Either way. Okay, these are great.
Can I say one more thing?
Please.
That brought up, the systems, because I taught at an art school later in my career, and I was given that freedom, right? The freedom to just like, oh, what books do you want? Design your classroom the way you want it. That was awesome. I worked for the Henry Ford Academy here in San Antonio, and that was excellent. But yeah, in those previous classrooms, though, another thing that we did that didn't allow that space was also creating collaborative, I don't want to say rules, but collaborative systems with my students. So we would design like the first week of school, and I ended up taking this with me to Henry Ford when I ended up moving schools, is designing like, what systems do we want here? And then I would kind of implement like pre-colonial or pre-Columbian or pre-colonization type of systems, right? Like bartering, the way we would tell stories orally, listening, also looking at even the hierarchies, right, in indigenous tradition, right, that were not what we see right now, looking and just exploring those ideas naturally and how we were going to do that in our classroom. So creating systems that were also, non-racist, non-homophobic, making sure there weren't talkbacks or insults or things like that.
Right.
And the students create the rules themselves, or the system, so that we could keep this equitable, I guess, space, right? That's another thing that worked for me.
Yeah, that's really, that's a wonderful thing to add too, is having students create their own rules. That's something also that Felicia Rose Chavez talked about in our other virtual pedagogy panel, that gives them that ownership, and it makes it a safer place too, I think. Anyone else want to add anything before I move on? This is great. Okay. Okay, we know how teaching creative writing from a neutral craft perspective can further marginalize racial and ethnic identity. How can teaching this way from a neutral in air quotes craft perspective affect other marginalized identities such as LGBTQ identities?
Well, neutral is really erasure. I mean,
Right.
like, oh, let's be neutral. Okay, what does that then? Okay, what do you want to do? Like, have an empty plate? Like, there's nothing. Neutral food would be no food, right? I mean, I'm guessing, because how do you become neutral? Um, that's impossible. So, and if you were to say I would neutralize it, you would really just be leaning towards, the white literary canon, and that again is just not right. And doing that we see the result. Actually, you see it in education. You see how still Black and brown and indigenous folks and Spanish, or I'm sorry, I'm in Texas, so it's mostly Spanish language learners. But you have your students that are not speaking English, right, or not speaking the dominant language or the language in our schools, and that now all of their education is the ones that have the highest dropout rate, the lowest economic, you see it. So to do that, you're really just destroying and minimizing and erasing and burying a huge group of people, and you can see it in the statistics already using a neutral education system that we've been following, for too long.
Great, absolutely.
As I was listening to you, Anel, I've been thinking about the word neutral and how I may have seen that function. And when I first moved to the Midwest, I'm originally from Los Angeles, and living in the Midwest has been I've had somewhat of culture shock while I've been here. And I lived in a small college town before moving to Chicago, and there was a sensibility there about the kind of writing that was workshopped in a creative writing classroom. And often there was a sensibility that if the writing was leaned in a little too much into somebody's culture, which was not the dominant culture, that people outside of that culture would simply just kind of turn away. They would respond to it by saying, well, I've never had this experience. I don't understand it. How do you expect me to workshop this? Mm-hmm. Right. And as opposed to thinking about the experience being depicted as just a human experience and focusing primarily on the emotion that the character or the individual is going through as it's being depicted, right? Which I really believe that we can all connect to that. I mean, that's the whole point of the humanities, right? Is just to understand the function of being alive. And so there's this sensibility that is still pervasive even today, which I mean, it shouldn't surprise me too much, but that sense that writing needs to somehow not touch on things that are either too personal or considered too cultural or too ethnic for some reason, because it then becomes inaccessible for some people. But I've also seen kind of it swing the other way while I've been living here in the Midwest. And what I mean by that is I've heard some primarily white writers say, well, I can write about anything, right? I can write about burritos. I can write about crimes. I can write about anything that necessarily I've never experienced, but it's not something that is culturally kind of steeped. And I don't understand that kind of approach to it, because it seems to me that if you're saying, well, I can write from the perspective like a serial killer, why should you expect people to understand that if you're saying you can't understand a story about a quinceañera or about like someone's tío crossing, the border? It's the same thing. It's the human experience. The context can be anything, and what we really should be paying attention to is the humanity that's being depicted.
Absolutely. Great. Anyone else have anything they want to add to that question?
I'll just add that going into reading creative writing, teaching creative writing, having students read each other's work, the assumptions that most students bring to work and that we bring to work, if we're not like decolonizing our minds, are assumptions of normativity. So that works for race and gender and ethnicity and sexual orientation. And I feel like most queer people have the experience of being in workshop and having someone like not understand a pronoun in their poem, or just not getting what's going on because the audience is a queer audience, or the audience is, not the people sitting around the table. I think that's a pretty common experience, and that's important to remember when you come to any creative writing teaching context.
Great.
And then also, and I've had that experience, you mentioned that, Alexa and Ruben, also, I sat in a workshop less than 5 years ago, I just want to say that, with my novel that I'm just finished, like 90% done with. And, my 30 minutes, I think it was 30 minutes that I had in this professional workshop that I spent lots of time off to go to, and the white women in my group told me that it was not believable, my queer characters, that I still needed to translate. Luckily, there was about 11 of us in the group, and about four of us were POC, and two of the POC folks were queer. And so we were like a little mini cohort within the group of the larger group. And so they were like, oh, no, that's not true, because, you can't speak when you're in workshop, you're just waiting and listening. And so they defended me. But that was awful. I mean, I wasted 10 days of my life. I could have been here with my students, my kids, my family, writing my novel, doing other things. That was a waste of time. But, what it did do, and the other part was that it created a new little cohort of people that we work together now, right? We're able to try to write letters to the workshop folks and do all these other things. But, it infuriates me, because I was doing that while one of the women in the group, a white woman in the group, was writing about a girl and a boy who fell in love in like some ruins near Tulum, and they were like this is a true thing. I don't know if the book's ever going to come out, but she was talking about this couple falling in love while excavating Mayan codices, right? I'm like, really? You can write that, but you're telling me this is unbelievable. So while that's happening, I think part of the reasoning is just it's like we cannot allow that. And that's what happens when we neutralize, is that they continue to tell our stories. We continue to be erased and colonized. Like I was saying earlier, it's just like, it gets worse and worse and worse. The levels of how our story just continues to get buried more and more,
I think going along with that, and I want to introduce this idea along with this question into this discussion, is the idea of silencing the author in the workshop. Because, that is not, that is taking away the opportunity to speak of someone who might have a chance to, to clarify, and explain their position. Do you all want to talk about that, or how you handle that?
I can start. I used to believe in that model, right? That model where, and I think it's primarily because that's how I was trained in all my academic environments,
right.
Which 95% of the time were taught by white people who maybe had gone to Iowa.
Right.
And so, that's the Iowa Writers Workshop model, where you just sit silent. And I think one of the problems with that is that, we don't necessarily read literature in a vacuum or in solitude, right? Like, it's not just like, you don't just pluck it out of thin air and it's not informed by anything in the world. It's written by a human being who's been impacted by the world they live in. And so obviously, all of our experiences are so different that I think it's necessary to understand the context with which this is coming from, because that will also add some nuance to the story. And it'll allow those in the workshop to be able to give nuanced feedback. Otherwise, we're just responding with broad strokes. And what good is that?
What good is that? Absolutely. Great. Thank you. Yeah, I love what you said about we don't read in a vacuum. I mean, how many of us now, I know when I read and I see something that a term I don't recognize, I look it up right away. I need to know right then and there. And so it's changed how we've read. So it should also change how we workshop, Great. All right. Okay. So going on, what are some good ways to achieve representation of multiple kinds of queer identities in the classroom without tokenism? I don't know if this goes back and now to, just be as queer as possible. I loved that statement. I don't know if that's an introduction to this or.
Well, I mean, tokenism is interesting. I mean, you have to just have a lot. You have to make sure you're inclusive. I mean, I don't know how to go about just making sure that you're representing like Black LGBT authors, POC, Indigenous, transgender, gender non-binary voices. I mean, just making sure that you're very, very inclusive about all voices and figuring out who those voices are, and also reaching out. I mean, as an educator also, I always am like, hey, I'm teaching this semester, and I usually will send 10 emails out. Like, could you send me your list? Like, what do you what do you do in your Mexican American Lit class? What do you do in your, race, class, and gender? What do you do? And then I just kind of get everyone's, and I see what they're doing, because it's 2020 now, or 2021, or 2022. And, there's new stuff. I obviously don't know everybody. I mean, I know who I'm connected to. So part of not being, tokenizing is also just making sure you're keeping, again, collaborators, I think, are really important.
I love that. Collaborators and reaching out. Right. Anyone else want to add?
I'll add that I think sometimes there could be a temptation to teach a certain text. I'm thinking in a high school classroom, like a whole class novel, to teach a certain text in order to help students understand more, like a marginalized identity. And then that text becomes about educating students about a certain group, like, whoever it is. So working against that impulse to make a text about just an identity, just like kind of like when we bring our own work to workshop, and other people take it as like an educational opportunity. Oh, can you go more in detail? How does that work? Things like that. It also doesn't have to be that way with selecting a text. So like, this is not the one text that we're using to understand the Black experience in America, right? Like, that's not how you can't isolate the experience like that. Right. So I think that's just another thing that I would think about.
I like all of this. Is your response, Alexa, is resonating so deeply with me. Mostly, I just remember always being taught by white instructors who might have had some liminal connection to other cultures, and I remember there were always these go-to books in my poetry workshops, right? Like anytime someone wanted to talk about a Latinx or a Hispanic writer, it was like, hey, let's pull out Gary Soto's book, or Sandra Cisneros, and I'm just like, I've never lived on Mango Street. Like, I don't know what's going on here. So, it's, I think we live in such a time where we can access text that is by, very specific individuals, like I'm Costa Rican American. And up until maybe about a year ago, I learned that there were maybe about 4 or 5 Costa Rican American poets writing in the US today. I think I know 2 of them. And so, I mean, it would have been wonderful if I had been able to read this while I was a graduate student or even an undergrad, right? Like what resonance that would have had with me to know that there are people who are from the country I'm from, or people who looked like me. But I love I love that idea of reaching out to people, and it's really through making those connections with other people that I too, like, I've too sought out collaborators. And I used to think that I couldn't do that. I used to think that I couldn't just email someone and say, hey, I'm teaching this class, can you share with me what you've taught? I'm not sure what I should be teaching, or maybe I'm missing something, but it's that that fear of being vulnerable, I think, and also just not knowing that I that was okay to do. So I think it's valuable. I think this conversation really is just valuable for me to really get a sense that other people are doing that, and that it's okay to do.
It's okay to do. Yeah.
Absolutely. But, I think also about communities here in the Midwest. I think about rural communities a lot, especially, and how there's just this sense of wanting to teach what has been taught for decades, right? The white canon, because people just don't know any better sometimes, or they're just lazy. And, the internet's there, and the internet can really give you so much. And I think if you're teaching to a group of white students, because there just aren't people of color in your classroom, I think that's an even more, you should have a greater sense of urgency than to teach books that are not by white people. Like, these students are gonna get this anyway. Introduce them to things that they haven't seen, or may have not be given another opportunity to encounter.
I'm just going to clap at that, Ruben.
Yeah,
absolutely. I'll just add on too that, one of the systems in place that perpetuates this straight white canon is the book room of public schools. What have we bought in the past? What's still there? Where do you get money for new books every year when everything that's in the book room is the things that have been in the book room for the last 30 years? Like, that's a structural problem that we're having to face.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I want to add too, on both of those notes, it's I found that some of the most generous people are authors. I mean, are authors and teachers. I mean, the most generous people, which is why I've always I just ask. In fact, it was Anel I, the poet, who said to me in my 20s, she was like, "Oh, just ask me. I'll give you some books." Of course, she's she's an amazing writer. Always, she lives in San Antonio, so that's how I got access to her. But all of my years, I'd be like, "Hey, Naomi, can you send me Never in a Hurry?" And she'd be like, "Okay, just come by my house," and I get like 20 copies. I did the same thing with Cisneros. I asked her. She's like, "Oh, I have a box," and I asked Norma Cantu, "Oh, I have an extra box." Some people have boxes of books sitting there. Yeah, some people don't. Just ask them. I mean, what are they going to do? No. Okay, fine. And others, people ask me now, "Hey, do you have a box?" No, I don't. But you know what? Use this one. Take this for my book, or go ahead, or, and reciprocal relationships. I've had some professors or teachers that don't have funds that say, "Look, I don't." And I charge people who have funds, trust me. So don't even ask. But if you don't, right, then yeah, I'll be like, for sure, I'll do a 30-minute Zoom or whatever, this or that, or I'll come in because I remember, but do it for me when I need you, and those are part of also pre-colonial of structures.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
So then you bring things back. Like, if it's not going to hurt me financially, yeah, I'll try to give you a box of books, and it works. And, we can also just do excerpts and then also, for people not in the academy, because I'm not in the academy, only every now and then. So sometimes I get a password because I'm teaching one class. But I asked my professor friends, "Hey, can you give me your login so I can get that essay downloaded, on Juster?" And they're like, "Yeah, hurry, don't give it to anybody." We don't have access to that. So also, if you're a professor, be generous about saying, "I'll download that essay for you and send it over,"
Right.
So I think there's a little bit of things that help me survive those times. Yeah.
Figure out those ways. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, moving on. How can we help our students understand current controversies around representation and the importance of lived experience in writing? You were talking about that a little bit, Ruben, and you had talked about that a little bit, Anel. About othering and that kind of thing. How can we help our students understand those things? Alexa? You wrote your name next to that. So.
Sure. Well, anyone can jump in at any time. I was just thinking about Paisley Rechdel's new book and how that would be useful in these conversations. And I went to a short workshop that she was doing, and she kind of walked people through how to talk about really these were texts that had to do with race and presented race in problematic ways in the past, and just how to just address it head on and open that conversation with students. So that could be an entry point, is not that we want to necessarily like bring intentionally problematic texts into the classroom, but that was one thing that came to mind. And I think it's also important in terms of representation to remind students about author identities, because I think we are still living in this time where new criticism has made us divorce the body from the text in a way. And Felicia Rose Chavez also talks about this in her book. So giving the author a body again and an identity. So for instance, when I was in my mid-20s and found out that Mary Oliver was a lesbian, how did I not know that, right? That information was kept from me. Or, when we're reading Raisin in the Sun, which is in the book room, right? Lorraine Hansberry, let's talk about her being a lesbian, right? All of these identities, which you can't see on the back of the book, or on the little like profile icon on the poem online, I think it's important to just say, because that just makes the difference of a student knowing who this person is and potentially seeing themselves as a writer, because you've just done that little bit of extra work to contextualize the piece.
Mm-hmm. That's a great idea. I love that, giving the author a body. I'm sorry, go ahead, Ruben.
As you mentioned, Paisley Rechdel's book, I just finished it, and I'm really excited. It's appropriate. It just came out from Norton this year, and I was really fascinated by her approach. So it's like a series of epistles. So she's writing it to like a student. So I was able to interview her recently about her book, and I learned that it was like the book was commissioned from her editor. So I don't know if those letters are actually real letters, but they're really effective in terms of using that form to be able to address us as readers. So it's almost like she's addressing us directly because she's writing these letters. And so what I found really effective about her approach to cultural appropriation is she makes this really interesting argument about when it's appropriate and when it's not appropriate to appropriate something. And it's not something that I ever had considered, whether something it's okay to appropriate something and when it's not. But she makes a really, I think, effective argument to say that one way that historically we've been introduced to other cultures is, well, traditionally it's been by white people writing about, or orientalizing or Orientalism, that exoticization of the other. But she finds examples in contemporary literature where appropriation at least has started a conversation, right? And I'm thinking of Janine Cummings's American Dirt specifically, and how that book was blurbed by a lot of contemporary Latinx women, Hispanic women, right? Cisneros blurbed it. Erica Sanchez blurbed it. A lot of really contemporary writers blurbed the book. And so that may lead people to believe that the content is okay, just as it is. But it was really an exercise for Cummings to really show off her research muscles. Not that it's culturally appropriate to do that, but she got us talking. I think she got us talking about this topic, and and there's a lot of stuff that can be said that's not right about it. I think Miriam Gerba had a lot of really interesting things to say about it, and I love Miriam. I love her work too. And but you know, you're right, Alexa. Like, there are so many authors historically that their lives are not contextualized, and so the content of their work then takes on a whole different lens. There's something that is so satisfying to know that there are books that we're reading that are written by queer people of the past. And I remember being in high school, and the only I think this was like early 90s, the only queer author I remember like ever really hearing about was like Oscar Wilde. And I just thought, wow, like how transgressive, right? 19th century writer, completely like unknown to me. This slew of 20th century writers. Here I am at the end of the 20th century, and none of these queer writers at least not visibly, were introduced to me as a queer person in the late 20th century. I hardly knew any 20th century queer writers at the time. And that's, I mean, how devastating. So I really do. I agree with you. I think that it's so important to contextualize who is writing, why they're writing. And it's even so much more important if you think about it historically, right? Like, how transgressive to have these queer writers writing about their clandestine lives. I agree with you wholeheartedly there.
And you asked also about how do we have our students understand these these current controversies, and like doing exactly what Alexa and Ruben have mentioned, just bringing those texts in, talking about who the identity of the author is, for sure. I mean, absolutely. And then also bringing in the history, bringing in that history, right? Talking about the history you're telling, that Ruben and Alexa just spoke about, like your own history. People used to tell me when I started writing, I would say, what do I do? I was in my 20s and it was the late 90s. They're like, oh, well, go to the bookstore and find, the books that are about like you, the ones that you identify with, and then figure out who those publishers are. And I'd be like, girl, those aren't there. Like, they don't have those at the bookstore, and the shelf is this big if it's LGBT, and it's all about like how to repair your illness of being gay or whatever, or like half of them are psychological self-help books, right? And then the other half are like 5 pieces of literature, maybe. That was then. And now we don't go to bookstores, right? So the other thing that I tell some of the younger folks in my queer familia, my family, because I have 2 queer children, and they have queer family and we have queer family, and so on and so forth. I talk to them about, look at your Instagram, or look at your Facebook, or look at your social media. Like, that is your world. You narrated that. You created that. You curated what you see every day. And that is all queer, POC, Black, Indigenous. It's your politic because you made it. But in all reality, the public doesn't look like your curated version of this world, and I try to tell young folks, like, the reality is what you see out there. So part of it is like, go and explore. I don't care where you go to the grocery store, go to anywhere, open up any magazine that is like just a magazine, and now count. What do you see in there? Like, what is the representation in that like pop culture piece of literature that you didn't design? And do that to 10 magazines that are at the grocery store, and you're going to find that you are in 0 of them. And that is another reason why we also have to make sure that, the controversy is pop culture. It's what's happening, what people are selling. It's capitalism. It's so many things which we are all a part of, right? I also am part of capitalism. I also am part of the, I guess, moving of the regular world, like, whatever contemporary things. But just be clear that your world isn't what you see in your social media. And I think that's another way that we're erasing things, right? Everything we see is based on the algorithm that we've designed. So the real world doesn't look like that. And we have to keep talking about that as well in the classroom. Because, that's just a reality.
Yeah, Alexa, you called that media literacy, correct? I mean, really talking to the students about what they're seeing and what they're not seeing. You know, that's real. I think that's really important. Really important. That kind of segues really well into the next question, sort of. How do you perceive, because you were talking about, Anel, about bookshelves, you know, being sent to bookshelves and not finding things there or finding very little. How do you perceive the evolution of the glass ceiling in queer writing? Do you think there's a fading of the pink bookshelves in stores, or what do you see?
I mean, I went to a bookstore this past weekend and there was no pink bookshelf. I was like, hey, it's Pride. You know that, right? It was a small
Right.
bookstore. I literally went up to the people that work there and they're like, oh, you have to talk to my manager. I'm like, you know, it's like June. Even Target has Pride stuff. You know? And we can have at least a section.
Right.
But that's true. And I really do feel like and it's tied to the question that you just mentioned as well, like, why is it important to talk about our lived experience in our writing? I'm challenged constantly, like, well, you're writing about your family again, or you're writing about a mom and a lesbian again, or you're writing about a young trans person dating, and that isn't that so close to your family? I'm like, well, that's what I know, and that's the book I can't find, so I'm going to write it.
Right.
And I'm going to encourage my students to do that. And when I went into that bookstore this weekend, I was looking for a specific book that does connect with me, so I had to order it. But you know, I think we still have a ton of work to do, if not more, especially with what is going on in Texas, and now with Texas and all these other states that are passing these types of restrictions, more restrictions on education. I do feel like there has been a reversal of the evolution of hopefully, you know, becoming more inclusive or having a larger pink bookshelf, and having more queer writing. I think the educators in the academy and editors, there are many doing great work, but there's definitely not enough. I think there still needs to be a lot more work, and I'll stop there.
Well, that really segs also into the very next question, which I had. So, I mean, it's all connected. So, yes, in states like Texas, I'm in Arkansas, red states, LGBTQ rights to identity and representation are being challenged by these laws. How can we teach creative writing in a way that supports our understanding of how these challenges are affecting our LGBTQ students as people and as writers? How do we teach in a way that is understanding of that, of what they're facing?
I think one way, just to start out, one way is just to be very clearly supportive. I like give preferential treatment to like my queer students, to my Black students, just like, yes, you do get preferential treatment. Don't tell anyone, though this will be airing live. But I think that shutting down any, this is like very teaching 101, shutting down any like hate speech or any like vaguely weird comments that people make, just right away, nipping that in the bud. I think that makes a huge difference to students. And they can read in between the lines of the texts that are assigned. They can read in between the lines of the kind of like course policies, like we talked about, making collaborative policies for how to engage. And it's amazing how many times by creating that environment, I'll have students like coming out in their writing, even if it's in a composition class. There's something that I did by being there, by teaching in a certain way that makes students feel comfortable acknowledging that identity to somebody in power. And I think that's a really important thing that happens. And I think that's something that queer creative writing educators will find is probably a common experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Anyone want to add to that?
I was thinking about what you were saying just now, Alexa, about kind of creating a safe space, or I don't know if I would say that I offer preferential treatment, but I do. So I remember when I was teaching in Lubbock, Texas, when I was a grad student there. Right, it's rural, it's West Texas. I just moved there from California, and so I was just like, "What is happening? Like, where am I?" Right, and I'm still going to teach and read things that I find interesting. So I remember teaching this introductory lit course to right, like all these undergrads who grew up like in Midland or Odessa or Abilene, like these small-ish communities in Texas. And so it's already a conservative place. These students come from conservative families. And here I am, like, I taught them, like, I remember teaching them a book by a writer at the time, Ryan Van Meter. He has a book called If You Knew Then What I Know Now. And it's all these short stories of him like coming out or realizing as a child that he was queer. And I thought, I said, we're going to be reading stuff that you may or may not be familiar with, you might find uncomfortable, but this isn't a criticism course. This is a course on trying to understand different experiences. And if you have any concerns about it, you have my email, but the classroom is not a space for you to talk about what you find either morally or ethically oppositional to your own beliefs. This is a space to just talk about the literature and to talk about these authors. And one thing that I remember doing early on when I first started teaching is I tried to get a hold of the author and like Skype the author in. This was when Skype was the big thing, and just Skype the author in either midway or at the end of reading the book. And I wouldn't tell the students that we were going to do this. So then they would read the work, come up with whatever thoughts they had about the work, and then they had to face the person who wrote it. And I'd say, make sure you have questions, and remember, this person is giving up their time and they don't have to be here. So you need to be respectful. And, it always turned out well. It always turned out pretty well. And, I think that there were some people who were very uncomfortable, but because they were either religious or there were these jocks that had to, play that role. But I exposed them to things they probably would never have been exposed to. And I think that's what's so great about being an educator, especially one that teaches writing or literature, is that you can introduce these people who exist in the world that may or may not be like them, and just make them face what might be challenging to them. I think that's what's great about a classroom, is that you can challenge people's ideas about what's right or wrong, or what it means to be alive. And you want to be in this classroom. This is my classroom. This is what we're going to do, and I get to choose the content. And I'm not saying that that's how I always run my classroom, but that was how I started, and that's how I first introduced really controversial topics. Is I just took ownership of the space and said, this is what we're gonna read now.
That's great, Ruben. That makes me think of the opportunities that we have in the classroom. And a lot of what I've been reading in the last couple of years about kind of opening up the classroom that way is about letting students at the beginning of class just kind of do a gut check around the room. And I think if you do that, it's kind of doing the same thing. It's allowing students to show who they are as human beings. And so someone could even say, well, to be honest, I'm not doing too well because this transgender law is really upsetting me. I don't feel wanted in my state. I mean, they can say that, and then other students can hear them say that. And, there can be some, this all really came home to me after the 2016 election. I had an intro class, and I had several students come in just so upset, and then other students why are you so upset? It's just what's the big deal? And one of them was like, well, I've been thrown out of my house. And another one was, had actually had a mental breakdown over the weekend over it, and talking about how this affected them, because it affects their lives. And other students who hadn't been so affected were like, huh, wow. I mean, they had no idea. So I think part of that is, and just like you said, Alexa, I mean, just supporting them and saying, wow, that was some really nasty legislation that just got passed. How are you feeling about it? Because it's, I want to get, because to make sure we have enough time to talk about, if there's any questions you think I have not asked or that we haven't addressed that you think need addressing here.
I wanted to share an activity.
Great.
Sometimes, it's always nice to like give an activity at the end or with teachers and recently I do this with creative writing classes and it's not mine. I learned this from other teachers and it's like morphed into different ways. I always say that, give so many great teachers out there. Sharon Bridgeforth was one of the teachers, amazing Black queer writer. If you haven't read her, read her. But she had us do lists of, just moments in our lives, right? Just that we can write down when we're doing memoir or just starting poetry. She would have us do a wet ink exercise. This was back then. So I've turned it into a lot of things. And most recently, I taught a workshop for a group of youth here at SAC, which is San Antonio Arts. And it's an incredible arts organization for youth. And I taught a workshop on being a good ally, right? Or that was what I was asked to do. And I said, well, why would I teach just a workshop on being a good ally? I'm a lesbian, queer, LGBT, gender non-binary person. Like I would like to teach and talk about that. Not, because then you're assuming, I mentioned to them, you're assuming that all of your students are allies. Why can't I just teach as a person? That because, I had to have that conversation about how that even asking me to do that is homophobic, right? Assuming I can only talk about allyship. And so that was good. We talked about it. We figured it out. And when I met with the students, at the end, I did talk about allyship still. But I had them do that list of 10 moments in their life when they have either been an ally, have someone been an active ally. We talked about what being a real ally was, right? Like speaking up, fighting for you, not making you do the work. We talked about that first, but I said a time that someone's been a true ally to you. Maybe they've talked to your mother for you. Maybe they've spoken to a teacher for you. And then I had them write about when you've been a true ally to someone that is not of your identity and race and class and gender, sex, sexuality. So they did like a wet ink fast list of these moments in their life where they could, weave in gender, sexuality, and race, and just different things. So that was a really fun activity, and they ended up loving it. And then they started talking and being proud of themselves for being like good allies across, the different isms, if you will, right? And then they started talking about it, and then they created and generated ideas of what they wanted to work on. First, they were doing a sticker project, like making bumper stickers, like, and so they were able to like come up with statements and things, and that was really fun. I think it could also be a creative writing project where they write, the narrative of that moment as well. So that I tell them.
Great, that's a great idea. Anyone else? Anything we haven't covered that you think is really important to end with?
If I can add one thing, many years back, when listicles were really huge, right? Making all these websites, BuzzFeed, right? Like all these sites had all these lists. I jumped on that and I created with a friend at the time a list of visible queer faculty, LGBTQ faculty at different in different creative writing programs. And because I, as a queer person, wanted to know, if I was seeking a place to study, I wanted to study with people who were like me, whether, it was my gender or sexual identity or cultural identity. stuff that I found was important to me as a person in the world, but I wanted to be able to see it, right? I wanted to be able to visually recognize that person as someone that I could connect with. And so for this exercise, I went in and looked at graduate programs and creative writing programs, undergraduate programs as well, where the faculty were in some way visible. Either in their bio, it said like, they got a Lammy or were nominated for a Lammy, or they wrote about, a certain kind of LGBTQ topic of some kind, right? I wanted some connection. I wanted to be able to either read it in their bio or see it somewhere in their photo, right? Some people, are either, they're visibly queer in some way, and I wanted to be able to identify that. And I remember getting an email from a faculty member saying, "Hey, you didn't put me on your list." And I remember responding and saying, "Well, how am I supposed to know you're queer? Like, I there's nothing online about that." And like, where are the tea leaves? How am I supposed to read this?
Right.
And so, so they were upset because they weren't included. But why is that my fault?
Right.
I really believe that if you want to make that connection, either as an ally or as a queer person, and you want to draw those students, I think people should make sure that students can figure that out, that they can do the research and find that you're connected and somehow that you're a queer ally or you are queer yourself. But that can't happen if you're not out.
Right. Absolutely.
So.
That's great. You have to, and whether you're an ally or a queer person or whatever, you have to put yourself out there as that. And I think that's such a great point. That's a great point, because I think we have a lot of people in our society right now have a fear of saying, oh, I'm not political or things like that, and you really need to be willing. I mean, these are the times when you really need to be willing to stand up for who you are, regardless. Yeah, it can't happen if you're not out. I love it. Okay, I think we have reached a natural conclusion. This has been really wonderful. I'm really excited for what this is going to bring to all of the people teaching creative writing students nationally and internationally. And I want to really thank you for thinking hard about these questions and bringing your experience to them. This has been great. So thank you.
Thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Ruben and Alexa.